Although it's been a few days since we've had Act 1 and Act 2 of the Archon quest for Snezhnaya drop alongside the release of the whole region, and while players have been exploring, uncovering secrets, and continuing on with the world quests, I wanted to come back to the Archon quest and give my unfiltered spoiler review of the story so far and why I think it has set up Snezhnaya perfectly. If you guys do like to watch these types of videos and you want to see more Genshin content, hit the like button and subscribe button as well. It would be truly appreciated and it helps me out in the algorithm, so I'd be ecstatic if you could do so. Also in the comments below, let me know your feelings and thoughts on the Archon quest and whether you agree with my points or disagree. To start off, I want to talk about Act 1 because I have seen some comments to suggest that it wasn't a great start, that it felt a bit boring and unneeded with the lack of a lot of big guns and too many tutorials. And honestly, I do agree with some of those criticisms and I understand where people are coming from. When we get to Snezhnaya, we are hit with wave after wave of tutorials, mainly surrounding the Eye of Grey and the Shadow Realm gun gameplay. The former is fine and completely acceptable to have in the Archon quest, but I do feel that the Shadow Realm stuff, at least currently, seems to be more emphasized in quests outside of the Archon quest, so I feel like they could have left that as a world quest or part of a meeting point quest even, I would say. Maybe something to do with Alosha, potentially, right? Beyond that though, I actually think that the other criticisms, such as the lack of the big guns and the lack of Project Stuja exposition at frame 1 or even Gnosis information, is actually a good thing and something I'm actually super happy that Genshin decided to avoid doing, to be honest. One of the biggest concerns I actually had going into Snezhnaya was that they'd potentially take away from the region and the people and shove it into like world quests instead, or like mini world quests, while the Archon quest hard focused on the bigger picture with the Tsaritsa versus the Heavenly Principles, right? I am very glad that they managed to avoid falling into that trap and did a great job in introducing Project Stuja, of course, but its focus was mainly on the reality of how it actually affected the people of Snezhnaya beyond Snezhnograd and the tense politics behind it as well. While it could feel dialogue heavy at times, I think the way they handled it was great, with each moment not lasting too long, especially during the Veche sequence. To go back a little bit in chronological order, to be honest, I should kind of go in order. I have to admit that I was actually shocked that at the first fact that our first meeting, our proper meeting with anybody in Snezhnaya, was actually with Piero, the Jester. Even more so was obviously his connection with Paimon, but we'll talk about that later on in the video when we get to Act 2. But it really kept me on my toes, wondering about the direction they were taking the story in, with such a big character already being in the play. Also, I'm very surprised, I have to admit, that Paimon fell ill pretty much just like that, frame 1, as my prediction when I made my video about predicting about the Archon quest events was that it would probably be a little bit later, probably later down the line, maybe around the time of potentially when we got onto the train for the first time or something along those lines. I also feel like they handled the dynamic between the Traveler and Paimon amazingly, because it just showed how much their relationship has developed over the last few years, of course, and it also brings back that whole idea of, while the Traveler has been primarily traveling for his their sibling, right? Obviously that was the priority in the first 2, maybe 3 years, right? But it's now become a case where there's way too many factors, with one obviously major one being Paimon, that ties them to Teyvat. The concern, the dedication, and continual reassurance that the Traveler was giving Paimon was great to see, and it's a well done reverse, I would say, of course what we saw in Notcry, as well as by extension also in Sumeru as well, where obviously Paimon was obviously more concerned about the Traveler on a regular basis, and especially during that section where we got kidnapped by Dottore, right? So I think it was a well done reverse of that situation, you could say. Meeting Alosha and the citizens of Sretomorsk, no, I'm pronouncing that very wrong, but we'll roll with it, was one of the best things they could have done to introduce the effects of Project Stuja. It gives us, the Traveler, a more pessimistic and negative view of how Stuja is not necessarily beneficial to the citizens in the long term, with the lack of resources not helping the average citizen in any way, and then having people trying to reap the benefits by either scamming or corrupting the schemes set out by the Fatui and the Harbingers. I really enjoyed this segment, and I have to add an obligatory note of affection for the mini sequence with Tugarin, as it set our the tone for what our goal was in Act 1, which was to uncover Project Stuja and identify what exactly is Stuja and why are the Harbingers advocating for it when the people are struggling so much, right? One thing I do think that could have been done better, however, once we did get to Snezhnograd, wasn't necessarily our discussions with the Harbingers or Adet or anything of that sort. I think those were actually handled really well, to be honest. It gave us a good indication of, how the Harbingers themselves were truly feeling, right? Saw some people complaining about the fact that, the Harbingers were a little bit too nice and, they were very accommodating to the traveler by saying, oh, they have to do it. We don't really like it, but we have to do it. But I do think, they've done so much together, the traveler and the Harbingers, right? Especially, the likes of Sandrone, Tartaglia, and Arlecchino, that it's fine, in my personal opinion, to be honest, that they did that. What I am more annoyed about, however, is, well, I say more annoyed is a bit of a stretch. I feel there's a little bit of criticism deserved to this, and that's, I feel like the sequences that were dealt with for the Exiphanes blade were a little weak, in my personal opinion. Since I haven't done the world quest, I should mention I am unsure if there's anything there for the blade, but considering it's in the Archon quest and we have to talk about the Archon quest itself, the name of the blade, and obviously the small snippets I saw in the upgrade menu when I was upgrading it via the Statue of the Seven, makes it seem like there should have been a bigger deal about it, in my opinion. And I feel like it was a little bit lackluster in how it actually appeared, and then the follow-up even after that, right? We got a small section in front of the Statue of the Seven and then nothing after that, right? So I will give them the benefit of the doubt that it may have been intentional to leave it very open-ended right now, and we will learn more about the blade maybe in the world quests or maybe inevitably in the Archon quests, and why it was hidden away where it was hidden in the future, especially in such an oddball place. But I felt like there should have been more oomph to it nonetheless, As I said, I do have a couple of theories regarding it, but I want to kind of experience the world quest just in case there is actually something there and there's more than meets the eye that I haven't seen yet, I am glad on another aspect of Act 1, which was how Rakot was handled. Because I'm not going to lie, the moment they mentioned Rakot and the fact that, they were at loggerheads with one another, the Fatui and Rakot, I was like, good lord, are we going to have yet another Watatsumi? And we'll have that whole scenario, but this time it's the Fatui and Rakot being at each other's throat and that dominating the scenario. But I will say, the introduction of Lelek and generally the fact that even not only the members of the Veche, but also the Harbingers themselves were considering, the ramifications of Project Stuja, and they were also trying their best to minimize the effects of it, even though obviously obligatorily they have to kind of do it for the Saritsa's goals. I think that made it a lot better because it just gave it a different dynamic than it being another regular old civil war that we'd already seen in Inazuma. Another thing that I wish was a little bit there, but again, I think it's a very big nitpick, I would say, is similar to the Watatsumi and the Shogunate and all that sort of stuff. I feel like the lack of a proper known figurehead for Rakot felt a little awkward at times, but again, I think that's a bit of a nitpick on my end, and of course having the likes of Lelek and everything, it made sense. It was fine, to be honest. It was fine. I just feel like considering what Lelek was doing and everything, I feel like the head of Rakot would have been more present in that sort of situation. Whoever it could have been, it could have been anybody, but that's just my thoughts on that. I feel like they could have done a little bit more with that personality, right? Because that was the weakness in Inazuma, right? With Kokomi as the general, which I believe shouldn't have been the case, right? I think it should have been somebody else. Potentially Ayato was my guess originally, right? Or it could have been somebody else, right? It could have been anybody else, but I felt Kokomi was a little bit weak in that situation. Now, let's talk about Act 1 and Act 2 by extension a little bit in terms of what it reminded me of in terms of story. And it reminded me of Fontaine with a lot of the good parts of Sumeru, to be honest, right? It made it a great start, in my opinion, as each day was basically a routine of talk, info dump, and go back and tell Paimon, which could feel a bit repetitive at times. And I mean, you could see where I'm coming with this, the prison sequence, you could say, in Fontaine, the murder mystery that was there as well in Fontaine, the samsara cycles in Sumeru, right? You could say that a lot of those were very similar in that sense, right? You could say that. But I feel like they did a good job here in terms of making sure that the amount that was happening each day was just the right amount, and it didn't outstay its welcome, right? It progressed really well. It continued the story very well. And then you get to that final day in Act 1 where you're with the Veche and the politics was happening. I think it was a great scenario because you had the whole 100 yards of the differing political views of various characters, right? You obviously had Tartaglia a little bit more pure, and the more, obviously, you could say manipulative one, more, logical thinking one from the side of Pantalone. I say logical, but more monetarily thinking one, of course, from the side of Pantalone. Then you obviously had the media OTT shenanigans, right? That media reporter that was there in the story. A lot of people might have felt like it felt a bit cringe, a little bit unnecessary, but that's just how media actually is in real life. You know how crazy they can get. Some of them, obviously, depending on which country you're in, are a little bit better, I'd suppose, right? But if you come to any like very dramatical country, like I'm not gonna deny it, you go to India, for example, I've seen the news media there, it's just a drama show basically, right? So you get some form of multiple aspects of what actually happens in real life politics without feeling like it's actually real life politics, which is good because you're playing a game at the end of the day. It shouldn't feel completely like you're sitting down getting bored at listening to what politicians have to say, right? They focused on the main point of topic, which is Project Stuja, gave it its due time, wasn't too long, had a little bit of media OTT shenanigans, was perfect in my opinion in that situation. Now, moving into Act 2, this was where initially I wasn't sure on how I was feeling about the whole stuck in theater shenanigans, right? Especially with the cast that we were with, right? You only had half of them being playable characters with Mitya, Vodenitsa, Odette, Alosha, and Valerie, and then the other half being NPCs, right? With Shram, Tonya, Shuganov, Kulchik, Vampana, Soboleva, and Turgov. However, the moment we went into full murder mystery mode, I was very excited. Honestly, I really was like, holy shit, okay, we're getting into something good here. I will admit, in the English subtitles, I could tell that they used Among Us a lot, which, fair enough, you're, trendy and all, but I wish they'd just let it be a little bit more natural and lack of Among Us references in that situation, I would have said. But I was very much looking forward to it at that point because, in my opinion, that is exactly what gets the characters to be properly shown, right? You are at your most vulnerable when faced with death and the reality of it all, and that is exactly what we got. Each character showing their weaknesses, the confusion of it all, and while it may not be appealing to many, it hooked me in personally because it carried also on a lot of what Act 1 was about as well. While I was a little bit confused about the nightmares, I want to talk about that a little bit before we carry on with the rest of the theories and, review. I have a theory regarding the nightmares, right? As to what exactly it was, getting back to the mystery and solving it all. I believe that the Traveler's Descender status, first and foremost, allowed them to be more conscious. Well, obviously still forgetting what exactly happened in those events, but during the nighttime events with the Black Mist and everything, they were definitely a little bit more conscious, right? It was, to my mind, the Black Mist was representing the ley lines and death trying to grab them and reclaim their souls. And the reason why the Traveler was able to escape each time without feeling the need to stop like other characters was due to that status as well. Shuganov, of course, you might be wondering, why did he survive, right? Well, remember who he was with at the time. He was with Mr. Door, aka Valerie, which obviously Mr. Door could be a reference, and this is my theory, to Shram leaving via the door earlier on in the day. In the story as well, I should say. Some could also say that marching upwards and escaping the ley lines and death is also a little bit of an indication and reference to Snezhnaya's constant push to rebel and break away from the laws of the heavenly principles, as we saw pictures and images of Snezhnayan backgrounds and scenery burning continuously, and then the glass shattering at various points, again breaking away, right? So again, that's just my theory, right? Anyways, let's go back to the overarching story. So the ringing death bells, of course, and the constant confusion, in my opinion, they nailed the fear and vulnerable aspects of each character, with especially Shram and Tonya, or as we found out inevitably, Tashka having some really sad moments and also bringing in a good amount, I would say a very little amount, but still a good amount of history about Snezhnaya and the Tsarits as well. How times have changed from back then, where the Fae and humans were at each other's throats, then moving on to, of course, this period of time where the extreme snow was clearly affecting so many individuals with the snow cough, right? I think it was great because it not only showed how in the past these moments were a thing and how it not only affected them in the past, but even they are affecting characters in the present, right? With Vodyanitsa relating a little bit to what Sham was saying, and then Shuganov with his daughter obviously dying of the snow cough, how that he related to, of course, Tashka and her death as well, right? I think it connected really well to the past and the present, and they did a fantastic job there. Another thing I have to admit as well, I will say this, I did get jump scared when Tashka and Vodyanitsa were in our dream sequence, to be honest, right? They really did well with that thriller theme. Honestly, it was amazingly done, in all honesty. The music, the colors palettes, everything. Fan-bloody-tastic. Honestly, I really liked it. Now, let's talk about the reveal, right? Now, this is where I know that there are some who are a bit unsure about how they feel about the whole murder mystery, especially with the reveal, if it was needed, the overall execution. And let's talk about what happens, right? On the final day, we see Mitya was able to come back thanks to, of course, Vodyanitsa's song, right? And we discovered that Renova was behind the entire situation and that they were already all dead. Now, I really think they did that whole pacing and reveal, the way they set it up amazingly, because the color tones, the music, the camera angles, it was like a proper thriller scene in my opinion. And while I didn't initially think about the traitor initially, right, I do think by day 4 I was really suspecting Alosha, and you can go and check out my reaction, but I'm pretty sure on day 4 I was already pointing out towards Alosha being a candidate because he was speaking a lot less, the way he was behaving, especially on that last day, or where, you know, Tashka was about to leave and Alosha was trying to stop her from leaving. I wasn't really too surprised by who was actually the traitor of the group, but I think the way they handled Renova and how she was basically taking the place of Alosha, I think that was fantastic, right? Making her apathetic, egotistical, full of hubris was brilliant, and her flaws continued to show. And what I mean by flaws was just her ego, right? At the end of the day, she was just happily revealing everything, happily just saying like, oh, you guys won't even remember to tell the tale because I'll take care of it and all that sort of stuff. I think it was great. And then, of course, Mitya was still able to counter her in a way, basically, at the end of it all because of her following the rules, right? The only criticism I have with this whole sequence at the end with Renova is I think even before it all started, or even when the first murders happened, most would have guessed it was Renova behind it all, because the 7.0 trailer in the special program showed us facing Renova, and we hadn't seen Renova up until this point. I think if they had hit it, we would have only realized or even guessed it was Renova in game once we got the death is near note, right? But the way they handled Renova's appearance and behavior was perfectly done and in line with how she behaves. I just wish we didn't know it was going to be Renova until it was in game. That's the only thing I wish they had done better, to be honest. It's really my major criticism with the way they handled the murder mystery, because my opinion on the murder mystery as a whole is that I think it was very well done. I'm not saying I think, I actually know that there are a lot of people out there who would say otherwise, and that it didn't need to be like that long. I think it was the murder mystery in sequence as a whole, from start to finish, from when we got stuck in the theater to the end, like literally when Mitya got up, when we got up and we woke up Mitya and all. It was about 3.5 hours long if you're letting the dialogue play out and not constantly pressing the button to skip the dialogue. But genuinely, I think to keep the stakes high, at least the feeling of it alongside the mystery, you needed almost all the days, right? The only ones I would see potentially being a skip was maybe day 1 or day 2. But obviously with the whole Adet being Lelek thing, it was a vital component to the story, right? It was a major aspect. You still needed day 1 because otherwise you wouldn't be able to prove it wasn't Odette behind the murders, right? And day 2 was obviously then them letting their guard down when they realized that, oh wait, it's not Odette. Odette was clear, right? While Genshin can be verbose at times, I just do not feel personally that this was the case in the murder mystery. Each day was progressed fairly well with our own investigations and learnings, along with some good development on the front of these characters we're playing with. Like, remember what I said earlier on, with the vulnerabilities, the confusion and everything, you get these characters to come out a lot more, right? You had Vodionitsa's personality coming out in full fruition. You had Odette coming to terms with Rosalind and her passing in the Traveler's presence. You also had all the NPCs as well, and how they not only gave us a good perspective of them, but in terms of their own stories, but also more history on Snezhnaya, with 2 of them being from a past year of Snezhnaya where there were completely different problems to the Snezhnaya of the modern era. Like, don't get me wrong, having the right length in a story is important, but gutting and shortening a story can also be really negative. I mean, let's look at Amphorius versus Plan Arcadia and Honkai Star Rail. If you guys don't know what I'm talking about, let me explain. Amphorius had much longer acts in each patch, right? And a lot of people originally felt it dragged a lot. And to be honest, even I felt the same initially, right? When it was 3.0, 3.1, I felt the same. But I think the time spent on developing and building a connection with not only just the playable characters, but the nation and its people is extremely important, because now we're in Plan Arcadia and since 4.0, and while some of the patches have been long, they've also been a lot shorter in other patches, and I feel like there's just a lot more disconnect between the playable characters and the player. Not forget the nation and the NPCs as well. Even between the playable characters and myself, the player, I feel like there's a disconnect when especially when a lot of the time instead is being devoted to running around and going into puzzles or platformers or whatever it is. I don't want that in Genshin, right? Because the most important thing in Genshin right now, and what they need to do and continue to do, is work on the world that we explore and live in. It needs to have time with not just its playable characters, like I said, but also the NPCs. So for me, the murder mystery lengthwise was just right, and it got the points across. Now, going back to the act and moving away from the murder mystery, let's talk about the last hour of that Archon quest, right? It was an amazing spectacle. Seeing the back and forth between Renova and us duking it out was amazing. It also shows how much the Traveler has grown, and the fact that, of course, Renova is potentially damageable, especially if she is distracted. As we saw that, if you guys didn't notice, the reason why she was hit in the first place was because she realized that Mitya and all were waking up, and obviously she didn't want to be there at that point. So basically, the Traveler was able to get a hit there. Now, I'm very curious to see why she was worried about the others waking up and her still being there. Maybe it's something to do, I don't know. It's kind of confusing, because I was thinking maybe if they see her, then the curse evaporates or something. That'll be very interesting if that's the case, potentially. But we'll have to wait and see on that front. But along with all of that, of course, we got a bit of an uncovering of the mystery that Paimon is and what she was all this time. I think it was great to finally get that right. I will also add that I'm very surprised about how open Piero was about not only just Paimon, but Project Mistletoe as well, considering all things said and done. I know I said in my predictions that we'll get information about what Project Mistletoe truly is at the end of it all, but I did not expect to see a whole ass weapon that they were generating using the anti-celestial energy made from the stellar linchpins, which of course are connected to the third descender as well. For me, start to finish, the end section was well done, and I'm glad that, this time around I felt Genshin didn't leave us with more questions than answers. I felt we got more answers. We definitely had some questions, no doubt about it. We still don't know exactly what the Gnosis are used for, why the Tsaritsa is really hard pressed against the Heavenly Principles, but we still got loads of answers, right, with what Paimon is, with Renova and the curses and all that sort of stuff, along with Project Mistletoe and Project Stuja. I think that was really good that we got all these answers, and of course it will probably continue on into version 7.1 now that the Tsaritsa is back and we'll be getting an audience with her, right? What I am also curious about going into future patches, and these are some questions I have coming out of the Archon quest, is of course Mitya's linkage with Renova. Remember, he did say potentially that his soul might be linked to Renova in some way, shape, or form, which will make things very interesting. And then obviously Paimon and her being summoned by Piero, right? It's a great twist because now it raises so many new questions regarding Paimon rather than the good old, oh, she might be Asmodee, she might be Astrol, she might be this, that, and the other. I think it's great because now, we can ask questions like, did our sibling know about Paimon? Why didn't they ever mention it? Because remember, the sibling lived with Piero as well at a point. So she would have, they, depending on you play the male MC or female MC, but the Abyss sibling, would have probably known about Paimon, right? If they were living with Piero before the Cataclysm. And obviously, we also need to know about Paimon's real nature because all we know is that she's an infant that came to Teyvat, obviously, when she was summoned by Piero. And she has no authority or powers really at this point in time. But we don't know if, of course, Renova's telling the entire truth, right? When she might have been in Celestia, Paimon might have some power, but we don't know if it was stripped away or when she came to Teyvat it was removed or what's happening there. But I would say that overall, I think the Genshin team did a fantastic job in giving us a lot of answers, but setting up good questions that now we know are new questions that'll actually be answered probably in the next couple of patches, I'd imagine, right? Overall, for me, the first acts of Snezhnaya were exactly what we needed. A good introduction to the region and its citizens while already giving us a premise on the risks and politics behind Project Stuja. And furthermore, the characters themselves were also handled extremely well, given good balance on time on all characters. Outside of Odette, maybe you could say, and even then I would say, like, yeah, she got a little bit more than most characters, but compared to like what they did in Nordcry at times, right, with so much focus on like Nefer at a point, right, where she kind of dominated and had her own mini story arc, basically, right? A character story quest during the Archon quest. I think this was a much happier balance and it flowed significantly smoother in the story itself. But I also have to, before I continue with Odette, I also have to give a massive shout out to Voronitsa and Mitya, who are full of life and had great personalities. I really hope they continue that into future characters as well. I know we have Danica and Vesna, who of course we got the preview for today, Vesna, and she seems to be a little bit of a firecracker as well. So hopefully there's some good personalities there as well. When it comes to Odette and her relationship with Rosalind, right? I know there will be people who dislike how they approached it, with her being okay with the way Rosalind passed and our involvement in it. But I personally believe they did a great job in terms of how they handled it. You know, having it be more of a strict teacher and student relationship where Odette didn't even want to be in that situation in the first place was a different take, and definitely one that added more conflicted feelings rather than what would have been a very simple case of resentment, especially as there was also a lack of closure between them before Rosalind's death at the hands of the Raiden Shogun. I think this gave obviously Odette a very solid character, made her a very solid character rather than just being a two-dimensional character, to be honest. And they did a good job in stringing the whole story together and wrapping it up with that amazing cutscene at the end. That animated cutscene was very, very well done, and it left it on a good note as well, to be honest. I think that left Odette's character on a very good note. I also cannot forget to talk about the amazing introduction of the Tsaritsa as the cliffhanger. Of course, it was the cliffhanger. You know, the title card fell at the end after that, right? The music, the walkway, oof, it was so good. I mean, it was pretty much what we saw in the trailer, and this is my problem. I think the biggest problem I have with the Archon quest is I think they showed off too much in the special program, you know, but to have it in game with the traveler being present along with the specific background music playing was brilliant and a strong introduction to the Archon of the region. And I think that's ultimately why I enjoyed these two acts so much, you know. Snezhnaya could have easily been the point where Genshin just moved into, you know, rushing towards the end game rather than caring about the region, right? But instead, we spent time understanding the people, the politics, the problems, and why Project Stuja actually matters, right? We got to know who the characters who obviously, you know, didn't have anything to do with the Heavenly Principles or the Abyss or whatever massive threat is coming next. Their only goal was the betterment of Snezhnaya. And only after we established all of that did we finally pull back the curtains and move into getting the answers we were looking for in regards to the Heavenly Principles, Project Stuja, Misteltein, and so on and so forth. For me, I would say that the acts combined rate at a solid 8.5 out of 10. I think some minor adjustments and changes with the tutorials and, you know, pre-release marketing would have ranked this much higher. But as a starting point for Snezhnaya, I really couldn't have asked for more. I think they did a fantastic job. Now let me know in the comment section, what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with me, disagree with me? What points do you think I made were spot on? What points do you think I was a little bit too positive on or too critical on for Genshin? You guys can let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Until then, take it easy everybody. Bye bye.